Hello and welcome. I'm James Milan. I want to introduce a series of conversations that we have facilitated here at ACMi on the ballot questions that voters will be voting on June 11th. Question 1 is the debt exclusion to fund the new high school, and question 2 is an override. What we have done is gathered folks to provide the strongest arguments possible, both pro and con, on each of those questions. And then we've given them all the space and time that they need to make those arguments as well as they can. So without further ado, we'll proceed into those arguments now. Enjoy, make the best use of them that you can, and don't forget to vote on June 11th. Hello and welcome. I'm James Milan, and for this conversation, we are going to be fleshing out the arguments in favor of question 2, which is the override, scheduled for June 11th. And to talk about that with us here today, we have 3 local luminaries, 3 people who have amassed an awful lot of experience in our local government, including the Select Board, the Treasurer's Office, the Finance Committee, the School Board, you name it. So we appreciate having Dean Carman and Annie LaCourt and Len Kardon here to join us, and again, to present their best arguments in favor of a yes vote on question 2. So let's start by just going over some basics that we have covered on ACMi programming before with all of you, basically. But somebody tell us just about the history of overrides in this town, what an override is, why it needs to happen, etc.
Sure. So an override is an override of the provisions of Proposition 2.5, which is the state law that limits the rate of growth in your property taxes. I think it's a fairly good law in the sense that it makes us think hard about raising your taxes beyond that limit, and it also makes us engage in a conversation with the residents and go back and say, here are the reasons why. Our expenses in Arlington grow at a faster rate than 2.5%, and so we have a history of periodically coming for an override. When we do that, we do it in conjunction with a 5-year projection, so we can say how long the override will last, exactly what it's going to cover, and exactly how we're going to manage your money and manage expenses to control everything that we can control to keep our cost growth as low as possible. And so we have successfully had multi-year overrides in 2005 and 2011, and we are coming back now for another multi-year override with a similar plan and a similar set of commitments to the commitments we've made in the past.
And I wondered whether you guys could also provide a little context for, how the override operates in Arlington versus in other towns and cities that you might be familiar with. So just to give people some perspective, you were mentioning 2005 and 2011, the last couple of overrides. Each one of those, I know, extended beyond the term that the voters voted on. I think they were 3-year overrides. Is that right?
So 2005 was intended to be a 5-year override. Our reasons for extending that for a year were simply the state of the economy at the time, that we had gone through the 2008 crash, and we just didn't feel like people had recovered enough for us to ask them to raise their property taxes more at that point, and so we waited a year. By the time we got to an override in 2011, we were in pretty desperate circumstances with regard to some of the cuts we were going to have to make. Particularly, I remember in public safety, we were going to be reducing minimum manning to an unsafe level in the fire department, things like that, and that was when we came for that override. We intended that override to last for 3 years, but we were also at the time in negotiations with our employees about methods for reducing our healthcare costs, the growth in our healthcare costs. At that time, healthcare was growing at about 7% a year, if we were lucky. In a bad year, more than 7%. And very shortly after that, the governor gave us the tools to move our employees into the state healthcare plan, and that gave us a $3 million reduction in healthcare costs, and that's what stretched that override beyond its 3 years to this point. So when I talk about controlling costs, those are the kinds of things that we try to do. We look at what's growing faster than 2.5%, and we try to come up with strategies to control those costs.
So we've had a couple of override votes, we can say now, in the last 20 years here in Arlington. Again, if I could just ask, how typical is that for towns and cities in Massachusetts, to the extent that you're aware, or is that an unusual situation?
No, for suburban towns in Massachusetts, similar to the profile of Arlington, overrides are fairly common, periodic operating overrides. I think where residents of Arlington have an advantage over other cities in town, if you looked at why our comparable property taxes to our neighbors are lower, is we will do periodic operating overrides. We will rarely do debt exclusion. So policy in the town of Arlington has been to only do debt exclusions for schools, because school buildings are too large for the capital budget. Everything else of a capital nature gets funded through the current operating budget. So I would compare that to, let's say, Needham, that just passed a $70 or $80 million debt exclusion to redo their police and fire stations, right? And so that's a different approach. I know Belmont, one of our neighbors, has done the same thing for their fire stations. It's probably gonna do it for their police station. But in Arlington, we just do debt exclusions for schools. Everything else is a live within your means, live within the budget process of repairing our capital assets.
Annie mentioned earlier that the situation in 2011 was pretty dire, and we were looking at some really serious consequences for not passing an override at that time. We're not yet, I assume you agree, at that point in this current cycle. So I think people may be wondering, well, why now? Especially because we do have a debt exclusion as well on the ballot on June 11th for the high school. That's going to be very significant. Why seek this override now if it's not absolutely necessary?
So I think the big thing, and we've talked about 2005, but to add on to that, what precipitated 2005's troubles was 2004. So we had gone for an override. We lost. We had large service cuts within the town. We came back for a lesser override the following year, intended for 5 years, stretched to 6. During the course of that time, we kept shrinking the size of our services and the scope of our budget and things like that. So by the time we got to 2011, we had staffing levels that were critically low. We had police per capita, fire per capita. Our teacher-student ratio was climbing to a level that wasn't acceptable. And so the 2011 override was there to stabilize things. But it was done with the, what I'll call the proverbial gun to the head. So everybody knew going in that if it fails, the Finance Committee, which I was on at the time, went to town meeting with 2 budgets. And it said, this is the budget. If it passes, we can maintain services and start to build back some of the stuff that we've lost over the last 6 years. But if it fails, it's going to be really crippling. So the reason for an override this year is not to get there. A lot of times voters say to us, they say, I don't like being told that if I don't vote for this, something horrible is going to happen. So this comes back with a 4-year budget stability plan that says, if you vote for this, this is what things are going to look like. We're giving it to you right now. We're being transparent. I think another thing that's important is doing it with the high school gives the voters the full scope of what's in front of them. Instead of going for the high school this year, sort of back pocketing it, and then coming back in 2 years and going for an operating override, when people say, well, if I knew that, I would have voted differently. Now everybody has all of the information in front of them. It is, without question, the most transparent fiscal policy debate this town has ever had, because everybody knows what's in front of them, and we move forward from there.
I'm struck by the fact that you mentioned that between 2005 and the override passed at that point and 2011, during that term, even though an override had been passed, staffing and other cuts needed to be made continuously throughout that period.
Yes.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, sure.
Is that in and of itself a typical situation? Are we looking towards that as a possibility even if this override gets passed?
We're not. And the reason I'd say we're not is when we passed the override in 2005, we had very tight fiscal controls on. So we said that the operating budgets would not go up by more than 2.5%. Health insurance would not go up by more than 7%. If health insurance did go up by more than 7%, we would maintain fiscal control by lowering the operating budgets.
Right.
So while in this backdrop, our school enrollment started to climb fairly consistently to the crescendo that we're in now. And so the school department had a really fixed budget of 2.5% per year. but they had student growth that was climbing. At the same time, health insurance a lot of times was coming in more than 7%, so the town budget had to continually be decreased on the operating side to cover for that. So the part of the design of this override is to keep the numbers, keep health insurance separate from the operating budgets. We have pretty good fiscal control right now on health insurance because of our being in the GIC, and that will allow us to continue maintaining what we have on the town side, where the overall town population is relatively flat, and then on the school side, be able to keep adding teachers as needed as enrollment growth continues over the next 4 or 5 years.
So I would just add to that I just want to correct one thing Dean said, which is that in that original override in 2005, what we committed to was keeping growth in budgets to 4% and the growth in health insurance to 7%. And as he said, we committed to keeping to if health insurance exceeded 7% and then further cutting the operating budgets. What we didn't do in that particular override was adjust for the growth in special education costs in the schools. So part of the reason we were continually cutting services is because special education costs were growing faster than other costs and healthcare was growing faster than other costs. And so they were continually eroding, the general operating budget. We made some adjustments in 2011. We added a growth factor for special education based on some research that Chrissy Allison-Ampe and I did. And then once we were able to get those healthcare costs under control, they have not grown at 7%. And we've been able to, part of the reason we were able to stretch is by adjusting that 7% limiter to something more like 5.5% a year.
And is that is what you're talking about just now?
Yep.
Because it does seem like healthcare costs, to the town are, like they are in many of our lives, one of the most significant factors. It does seem to be the pivotal factor in this case. Can we anticipate, again, going forward, that those changes that were made will mean that that we are comfortably under 7% growth into the future?
Yes, and I believe that we changed that limiter in the commitments on this override. We have also reduced the growth, that cap on growth, from 4% to 3.5% for the schools and 3% for the town side. So we've also put tighter caps on the general growth in the budget, which means everybody has to concentrate on getting done what they have to get done, plus anything they have to add within those budget limiters. But I would say that on the school side, a different picture has emerged. And I don't know, Len, maybe you want to talk a little bit about both the effects of new growth and also, the other services in the schools that have been eroded because of the taking some time to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, so since the 2011 override, we've had almost 27% student growth. And we're predicting another 10% over the next 5 years. So that's hundreds and hundreds of students that we've been adding. We did go back to the town financial authorities in 2014 and say that the existing limits on our budget were not sufficient given the number of students we were adding. So we were allowed, an enrollment growth factor was added, and it was giving us about $4,000 to $5,000 per new student each year. But we spend about $14,000 per student townwide. So as we've been adding students, we've been able to add enough classroom teachers so that class sizes have generally kept stable. They've crept up a little bit, but we haven't seen huge increases in class sizes. But what we have not been able to add is the support staff, the social workers, the nurses, the tutors for reading and math, and things like that that are needed both because of enrollment growth and because of increased needs of our students. So as part of this conversation about what we're going to do for our financial plan, there was an adjustment made to the enrollment growth rate so that we are getting more, almost $7,000 per student going forward. And we're getting a pot of money each year to help us meet some of these long-standing needs that we've had. So it'll be $600,000 in the first year, an additional $600,000 in the second year, $800,000 in the third year, an additional $800,000 in the fourth year. So by year 4, our budget will increase by $2.3 million. And that will allow us to not only continue to address the enrollment growth, but also to undertake some of the initiatives that we've been wanting to undertake but haven't been able to. So one thing that the state is pushing, it's a national goal, is to close the achievement gap, and that's the gap between your high need students and the overall population. It's measured by standardized testing, but clearly there is a performance gap between our high need students and our regular students. And Arlington and most towns around us have not been able to make much progress in closing that gap. So we have a series of initiatives in special education and in interventions like those math tutors and reading tutors to try to close that achievement gap over the next few years. We have a few small areas we want to improve instruction for students. For example, at the middle school, we want to introduce computer science curriculum. It's optional now, but we want everybody to have that. So there's a few targeted areas where we need to add more curriculum materials. We want to fund library books, which we haven't done since before 2000, things like that, where we want to invest some money. And finally, we do have to continue to attract and develop our staff. So professional development has lagged, again, as we focused on classroom staff. Our salaries have lagged behind neighboring towns, and so there's a lot of need in the school district, and this plan will actually give us additional resources to start meeting some of those needs.
Okay, so that, and you're saying that's all baked into the numbers that people are considering. That's all
Yes.
part of the override itself.
Yep.
And having mentioned numbers, let's talk about what kinds of figures we are talking about. So I know you guys, we all have access to what the average hit is going to be for people's property taxes. I'd love for one of you, first of all, just to again remind us what the difference is between these figures for the override and figures that people will see that are connected to the debt exclusion for the high school. What is the difference between those?
Do you want to take that, or do you want me
Yes,
to?
so the very simple way, because I know there was confusion this past year, operating overrides are permanent increase to your tax bill to fund forward-looking government services, and it hits your tax bill almost immediately. And so if we pass the operating override on June 11th of this year, it will go into the tax bill for the bill due February 1st. So you'll see it almost real time. I mean, it's not going to be in the November bill or the August-November bill, but it'll be in the February bill. That is opposed to a debt exclusion, which hits your tax bill as the capital project is incurred. And so there's a lot of times a 2-3 year lag on when the bill actually hits your taxes.
Right. So yes, and in other conversations we've had about the debt exclusion, people should understand that whatever the total figure is for the anticipated hit on their tax bill, that is going to be spread out probably over, I think, 3 or 4 years. Fiscal year 2022, I think, is when it will be, again, if it's passed, when people will be feeling the full effects of that. So let's. I want to ask you, what if viewers are seeing on their screens now the type of property and the average hit? I'm wondering what kind of context would you guys like to provide for the numbers people are looking at there?
Well, I think for me, the biggest form of context here is to consider that increase in your taxes compared to the services that you receive. If you look at Arlington's visual budget, and I don't mean to tout my own horn here too much, but if you look at it and you dig in really deep and you look at individual services, you'll discover that that $376 for a $752,000 home is something more than what you're paying right now entirely for all the police services you're provided with. And I could go through dozens of categories like that and point out that when it comes to the security of your home, the road in front of your house being cleared, the schools being available for your children, so on and so forth, all of that is costing you less money than it would cost you to purchase it individually if you had to buy all those services yourself. And so that $376 is an increase on what's already a very good deal for the services that you receive.
And let's just remind people that you said at the beginning there, if you look at the visual budget, and
Yes.
everybody can look at the visual budget, which is a graphical representation of
Right.
this whole complicated story, and they can access that on the town's website.
Yes.
So just a reminder that is the case. So of course what I hear you saying is yeah, government is going to be able to continue to provide these services in the way that we are accustomed for less money than it would cost you to buy them a la carte. But isn't that what government, isn't that what government is all about?
Mm-hmm.
It is, but so look, I think the number that people talk about a lot is it's for an average single-family tax bill. It's $376 a year. It's real money. Okay, it's not a cup of coffee a day or some of these like crazy rationales people try to get. That's real money.
Especially because you're saying, as you already clarified, that's every year from now
plus
on.
2.5%, right? It's real money. Okay, but I think what residents should appreciate or respect or understand is the town of Arlington is limited in service providing to core services. So I didn't calculate the number before I came here, but like 85% of the budget are teachers, firefighters, police officers, and DPW employees. That is the town. I mean, we don't have this large wing for economic adventurism. We don't have this, weird kind of offshoot program that we're running. I mean, we run 4 core services, and then we run a series of smaller support services like accounting and bill collecting in the treasurer's office and the town clerk's office. So if you want to get married, you can get a marriage license and things like that, record your kid's birth. But those are real small offices. Planning, they have a small number of people. But that's what the town of Arlington government is. It's small. And so I think that goes back to Annie's point, which is, it's real money, $376. It's not a joke. It's nothing to sneeze at. It's nothing to just brush off. But we're not asking for this money for anything more than the core function of lives, that their daily life in a town or a community.
Having said that, of course, you mentioned that the vast majority of our expenses are going to providing those core services. Those services are generally provided by the personnel within those departments. Personnel is one area in which there have been some voices raised saying, hey, do we either looking at personnel that have been added in recent years or or saying why can't we do something to reduce expenses around personnel? So how would you respond to that?
Well, so the number that's being tossed around out there is the idea that we've added 26 positions since 2011, and we have added 26 positions since 2011. I know about some of those positions. Dean, I think, knows about other of those positions. In the analysis that I did, 13 of those positions were in public safety. So we'd have to ask ourselves, what is the increasing public safety need there? I can imagine some things. We have an opioid crisis going on that affects the town. We have the need to provide a huge diversity of services that sometimes I think people aren't aware of. So the police department deals with youth and youth diversion in advance of their actually ending up in the system. They deal with domestic violence, and they run a domestic violence program that is centered around the idea of helping someone move forward and out of the relationship when they're ready. So there's a lot of support services that are being run. One of the positions that they added is a social worker to work with officers when they're dealing with people who are committing crimes who are suffering from mental illness, so disorderly in the street or whatever, and how do you best approach them to make a safe arrest or get them back home to their family or provide them with what they need without having to take out your service weapon. So those are the kinds of things that we've added in public safety. We created a department to do facilities maintenance because as we're building all these new schools, people were concerned that we wouldn't maintain them and they'd degrade fairly rapidly. We're about to build a very expensive high school if we manage to pass that override. And part of the way we've kept costs down on that project is because we have a proactive facilities plan. Part of the way we do that is because we have a facilities department that is tasked specifically with maintenance. So when we add positions, we add them to solve problems that we know we have. So I don't know, Dean, if you want to add to that, anything about
No, I think that's perfect. And then I think the thing I would add, though, is I remember there was one year we added 2 police officers to patrol Mass Ave, because if people remember, there just became this uptick in pedestrians getting hit on Mass Ave by cars. And so the police chief went to the town manager and said, look, our staffing isn't large enough right now to prevent this from happening. And so we need 2 more positions. That was a good example of proactive addition. The other thing that has been going on since 2011 is and this is where I think some of the confusion comes in on our staffing level. A lot of time the town manager models staffing that comes out of the general fund. Right now we're getting into this government finance speak, which everybody realizes when they look at how government, like municipal finance works, it's about as clear as mud, right? And we had positions that were funded through the community development block grant, which the federal government announced they were both freezing for us and then over time decreasing. And we had positions that were in CDBG in the planning department. So those had to be moved over the town side. So even though it wasn't a net increase in town personnel, from a general fund arithmetic perspective, we added 2 people. And then there were some other personnel that were funded through these not general fund buckets, like revolving funds and things like that. And as those revenues go away, or grant funds or things like that, they were moved to the town side. And so what you see is this perspective that there is continued growth that may be greater than it would have, than it really is. It's maintaining the number of people we have, adding some strategic employees, and then funding them through the general tax revenue versus a grant that was going away.
Okay, yeah, so what I hear you saying then is that, let's, just thinking again about the 26 people that have been added, you're saying that in large part, as Annie was saying, those are needs that were identified and positions filled to meet those needs.
Yep.
And then also, Dean, you're pointing out that some of that just has to do with what the sources of revenue are that you're drawing from, or what the source is that you're drawing from to pay the salaries for the people that are already working for us. And you're saying that some of that transferred from some other source to the town. And that accounts for certain things as well.
I think it's also important to point out that although we add administrative positions when we need them, the bulk of those positions are not administrative positions. They are not, as has been bandied about, bureaucrats. They're frontline staff. We added frontline staff in facilities. We added frontline staff to public safety. We added at least 1 frontline staff position to DPW, which is making a huge difference. And so it's important to just note that, I think.
And I wondered whether, and again, I'm not trying to surprise you or throw something at you that you guys don't have the answer to, but at least generally, again, just to go back to that growth of 26 personnel, what kind of percentage of the overall local workforce does that represent?
On the town side?
On the town side.
Slightly under 10%, probably about 8%. And then, so the town manager has this great chart in his annual budget that he produces that gives about a 15, 16 year retrospective of town personnel. And I had looked at it this weekend. And one of the things I thought was interesting is we've crossed back. We are at the point in total personnel where we've gotten back to about 2005 levels. So it wasn't the drastic cut from 2004 to 2005, but we've gotten back to that early 2004, 2005 level, which frankly is something that in 2011 we said we were trying to get to. So it's not like we said up front that we were not trying to get there. We said, when you pass this override, one of our goals is going to be to get back to those service levels. So we do have adequate staffing of police, fire, and DPW.
And how involved? Actually, I want to go back to a mechanical question before we move into the last part of the conversation, and that is, how is or I guess who among town boards and agencies, et cetera, is responsible for coming up with that final figure for the override?
The Board of Selectmen.
That's the select board who is making that determination in the end, with a lot of consultation, I assume.
Yes, I mean our whole budget cycle has a lot of people involved in it, right? So there are employees of the town. There's long-range planning. There's the Board of Selectmen, Finance Committee, the school committee. Everybody kind of wraps their heads around what are the service needs versus what are the resources, and prioritizes. We never get to put everything in the budget that we want. I don't think it's even conceivable to most of us to do that. The schools produced this great 5-year plan this year that's sort of a detailed 5-year plan of the services that they want to begin delivering that are the areas where the schools have been really pinched, as Len was talking about. And it's amazing. It's this really forward-thinking look at what are the things we need to provide. But I don't think anybody's under the illusion that we can just go, oh, well, now that we know what's on the list, we'll just fund the whole list. We're not funding the whole list. I don't know, Len, if you want to talk about how you're prioritizing that.
So part of the goal of developing the 5-year plan was to give the town leaders some information about what our needs were, so that when coming up with this number, they could take that into account, and they did. So there's a 5-year plan available on the school website, still in draft, but it's mostly together, about these things that I went over, where we need to close the achievement gap and do some other things with dollars and positions attached to them. And the funding that I talked about, the 600, 600, 800, 800, will start to get us some of those items, but it's less than half of what's in there. But that information informed the discussion about what our plan should be for the next 4 years. And so, in addition to changing the enrollment growth, which will help us going forward, keep us from having these shortfalls going forward, the select board also agreed to include this additional funding in the plan for the next 4 years. And then they added up all the numbers, found out what the shortfall was, and the deputy town manager, who's basically the CFO, does that calculation, and it came up, we're $5.5 million short. So that's how the number was generated.
Okay.
And I think, can I just add, I think that process that occurred over the winter I think it's important to talk about it a little, because I think it might give people some insight into how town government works. So the school committee's budget subcommittee, which Len is the chair of, created this 5-year plan, and they identified their needs and where they needed to add resources to, and they came up with a number. They then give it to the finance committee, who has a school department budget subcommittee, and like all accountants, because I'm on that subcommittee do, I think we cut it by about 75%, right? I mean, really just cut it. And so you get into a point where you're like, okay, well, it's not going to be at that point, it's not going to be the school committee's number, and it's not going to be the finance committee's number, and we're going to work to figure out what the right number is. And that brought us to the next iteration of this, which is the select board saying, okay, as part of the override, we will add this proposal for incremental funding, which, as Len said, won't get the school committee and school department all that they wanted. We'll get them about half of what they wanted. But we're going to put it out to the voters and say, this is our plan, this is the process. Some of you watched it happen, most of you did not. But this is how we're going to move forward, and it's out on everybody. It's out on every website. It's very transparent, and it sort of shows that it wasn't this moment where the school committee said, "Hey, we want this number," and everyone said, "Sure, we'll give you that number." It was, we're going to work through this. We're going to see what we can afford, what can fit into the current budget, what should go out to an operating override, and what's fiscally responsible into the future.
Yeah, I think you guys have provided me and our audience with a good understanding of procedurally how you get to that number and what kinds of hard data that number is based on, et cetera. Let me ask you, is this the right number as far as you guys are concerned?
Yes. I'm sorry.
We'll let Len talk.
Yeah, sure, certainly, yes. I mean, I think we get asked that question, why didn't you ask for more? Why don't we all go storm town meeting and get more from town meeting? And the problem is that that's going to require a larger override. That's going to hit our neighbors harder. And we're having these discussions. The total hit of the combined overrides, the override and the debt exclusion over the next few years is going to be significant. And it's hard for people on fixed income. And so we, as a town, as a state, the way we do property taxes and local taxes is very, very challenging. Arlington does not have commercial growth that can offset some of these expenses. So the burden falls only on our taxpayers. We're trying to get more state aid. We got a significant boost in education funding. We're hopeful for more, but otherwise it falls just down to our local taxpayers. So we have to balance that with our needs, and it's a very difficult process. A lot of voices are involved, and this plan strikes a good balance between our needs and asking for too much.
And I'd like to say about that process, okay, that it is a very difficult process. It needs to be a difficult process. So we all sit in small rooms with, boards of our peers, finance committee for Dean and I, school committee for Len, long range planning for, I think, both of these guys. And so as we are sitting in those rooms and talking about this, I don't think there's anybody who sits at those tables who looks at a list of the things that we would like to fund and says, oh, let's just do this. We always have the taxpayers at the back of our minds. We are always asking ourselves, how do we balance the ask with what's possible for people? Because I don't think any of us wants a taxpayer to go into the booth saying, I have to vote no, even though I support some of what they want to spend this money on, because I simply can't afford this. We want to hit the sweet spot where people can say, yep, I understand the need, and I can stretch to that. And we also want to offer as much as possible relief to particularly senior citizens on fixed incomes who need assistance with their tax bills because their income isn't growing like it is for some of us who are still in the workforce.
Yeah, so let me ask you, I appreciate the fact that you guys just brought that up. It was where I was heading anyway, and that is, I have had a number of conversations through the various programs that we do around relief for those either on fixed incomes or for some other reason are going to be having a much harder time dealing with this if it goes through. I understand that town meeting intended to address or introduce or consider some things beyond those programs that we're already aware of and I've spoken to you guys about in the past. I'm wondering, since I assume all of you were in attendance there, et cetera, whether there is anything new or different that can be offered to folks who are listening who are very, very concerned about how this is going to impact them personally.
I can take it. So there is a proposal that was passed by town meeting. It's dependent on state action. So the state legislature has to either pass a bill that will allow all towns to do this, which they're considering, or pass our piece of legislation that will affect our town, which is modeled on something that a couple other towns have done, Sudbury in particular. So we're optimistic that through one of those two options, it will be passed into law, but that's a dependency. But what the new law will do is for seniors only that have certain income limitations, that live in a house that's below a certain value, it's under the state circuit breaker law, which is an income tax break that's currently available for seniors in Massachusetts. They will get a property tax break, about 50%, and there's some limitations and all that, but hopefully for a small group of seniors that do meet the requirements, that have these limited incomes, it will be a significant relief once it finally gets implemented.
Okay.
We've also lifted, over the course of the last 2 years, we've increased the income limit for households who are eligible for various senior tax relief programs. And I want to say we lowered the interest rate so that if you, for example, defer your taxes, if you're income eligible to defer your taxes and those income limits went up, then the interest rate that you're paying on your deferred taxes until your estate settles went down. So we're hoping that more folks will understand the value of those programs and take advantage of them. We do know that there are many residents of Arlington who are eligible for one program or another who are not taking advantage of it. And so the other new effort is an effort to, and this isn't related to the override, it's just a general effort to make sure the information gets out to eligible senior citizens about the programs that they could avail themselves of if they want to get that tax relief.
So despite everything that you guys have laid out on the table here, I do still hear a voice in my head that's saying around expenses and the override in general, have we really done all that we can? And I guess I would like to just ask you to address that in a particular way, and that is perhaps you may be aware of specific program or programs or areas in which you looked hard, the various groups that you are all part of and that do all of this deliberating behind closed doors and in your free time, et cetera, which we appreciate. Anyway, an example or two of something in which you looked super hard at trying to reduce that expense or eliminate it or something like that, and just in the end, you were not able to do that. You were not in good conscience, let's say, able to do that. Is that an answerable question?
Well, it is, because I think so. The challenge becomes when you're cutting, right? If you thought about it for a moment in a purely abstract sense. Is there a lot we could do? Well, yeah. I mean, if you were okay, I'm just going with some draconian, right? If you were okay with like 40 kids in a classroom in a school, yeah, you could just cut a whole bunch of teachers and drop down costs. But I think one of the challenges we tend to have, or not one of the, but the challenge we have in government is providing. It's like you're providing the minimum amount of services that people believe are acceptable, right? So as school enrollment has exploded, the parents are coming in and saying, like, we need to get down class size. We can't have classrooms in the elementary schools of 30 kids. We got to keep them in that sort of reasonable range. And amazingly enough, people have recalibrated their definition of reasonable. So my kids are in 3rd and 4th grade, and we view classrooms of 25 or less to be reasonable. I think people whose kids have graduated from the Arlington Public Schools would think a 3rd grader or a 2nd grader in a class of 25 is insane, right? But we have sort of reset our thinking on that. We said, okay, 25 is fine. It used to be 18, 19, 20. Now it's bigger. We're okay with that. And then some of these sort of other service elements that people in town had thought that they would be okay, they would like, or they'd like in the future. People sort of step back and say, okay, not now. This isn't our time to do things like that. And you see that a lot with the capital budget, where this large basket of things will come in every year, and things that people want to do, and things that are they're nice to do, or they're fun things to do, or they're kind of exciting, but we're just not going to do it, right? I mean, you'll see a lot of our neighboring towns. There have been movements to a lot of communities in Massachusetts to put these turf fields in, right? Because turf fields are fun, right? You can play on them all year round. The grass doesn't get beat up. You never have to close the field down. And you see a lot of communities. I know Natick put in a nice turf complex. I'm blanking on a couple other communities that have put in nice ones. Well, that has come up on the capital planning side and just been dismissed right away as a luxury item. Like, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do something like that when we have all of these other challenges with facilities like DPW buildings and things of that nature. So it's really, I mean, that's kind of the essence of providing government services, is to find, what is the lowest level of tolerance? What is the tolerance level you can push the citizens to before there's a mutiny, and then deliver that to them. And that's the game.
Yeah, and I think that our town manager and his staff in his office, his deputy and his assistant, and his management analysts they are experts at this, at figuring out a way to deliver a service as efficiently as possible. And every time, once in a while, they do something that just makes me really want to choke. Excuse me.
And she choked.
There it is.
And she chokes. Outsourcing. And more recycling and composting for trash collection, so that there's less of a trash stream. So
these are things that you. I'm sorry. You're citing those as examples of things that
we've done to reduce costs.
Thank you.
And some of outsourcing, not my favorite, right? I'm a union girl from a union town.
Got it.
So.
All right. Well, that is about all the time that we have. It has rushed by, as it tends to do. There's a little relief for you, Annie, overdue perhaps. But I wanted to thank our guests. As promised, they are a knowledge base to be envied and for us to be treasured. That is Dean Carman, Annie LaCourt, and right next to me, Len Kardon. We really do appreciate you guys coming in for the conversation. Don't forget, of course, to vote on June 11th, and we appreciate your being here. I'm James Milan. We'll see you next time.